Today we're going to continue talking about Ronald Reagan and also talk about his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and the role that both of them played in ending the Cold War. Now, some of this is going to be a review, but most of it is going to be new information, and the first page is fill in the blank. Now, Reaganomics, remember that term, Reaganomics. What this basically is supply-side economics, increasing the supply of things, lowering taxes, trying to stimulate the economy, and some people call this trickle-down theory. Trickle-down economics was a big term at that time, kind of a buzzword, and that is what Reagan said would happen with Reaganomics. He said once you cut taxes on the rich, once you stimulate business growth by cutting regulations, then that wealth that accumulates at the top will trickle down to the masses. It's going to come to everybody else, so everyone will get richer as the rich get richer. And it's debatable whether or not this is an effective strategy. If you ask Republicans, they say trickle-down economics is good. If you ask Democrats, they say it doesn't work. All right, SDI, remember the Strategic Defense Initiative? This was the system of laser beams and things that was supposed to be launched into space that would shoot down potential nuclear missiles from Russia. This was never built, and it was very expensive. This is what eventually put our debt over the 1 trillion mark. And it didn't exactly work, but it was very effective because it scared the USSR, and then they poured a lot of money into making their own strategic defense initiative, which eventually bankrupted them. So us making SDI really did bring about an end to the Cold War, even though SDI itself did not work as planned. Another landmark during this time was the first ever female appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Her name was Sandra Day O'Connor. Go ahead and write her name in the margin. First female ever appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. That was by Ronald Reagan. That was in 1983. Her name was Sandra Day O'Connor. Since then, there have been 3 other females appointed to the Supreme Court. Also, around the same time, you have the first ever female vice presidential candidate. Now, she did not win. Her presidential candidate did not win, but still, the fact that a female could be on a ticket for a major party was a very big deal. Now, she was a member of the Democratic Party, and this was in 1984. She ran with Walter Mondale against Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and they lost 49-1. Lost in a landslide, but still, big deal that a female got on the presidential ticket for the very first time. So her name was Geraldine Ferraro, and something she said was, if we can do this, we can do anything. So basically a big step for women, her being on that vice presidential ticket. One slogan that was used in the 1980s by President Reagan, and especially by Nancy Reagan, this was one of his wife's big First Lady pushes, was to end drug use or to prevent or limit drug use in the country. So it had become a very big deal by the 1980s. A lot of people, especially a lot of young people, using illegal drugs. And the slogan that was used was just say no. And that's something you guys have probably heard before too. That was started with the Reagans and what they called the war on drugs. They say just say no to drugs. So in 1988, you have a lot of people very happy with President Reagan and wanting 4 more years, but of course he cannot run for a 3rd time. So they go with the next best thing. They go with his vice president. And in 1988, Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, won. So he was Reagan's VP for all 8 years, and then he won the next election for himself. And we'll talk more about him in a little bit. But the USSR stopped being a communist nation during Bush's time in office. Okay, so the USSR collapsed, and this ended the Cold War. In 1991, you have the Soviet dictator named Mikhail Gorbachev, and again, we'll be talking more about him on the next page, but he pushed for economic restructure and openness prior to 1990 because he believed that the USSR should be a non-communist nation. He wanted to reform communism, make it not nearly as strict so that they could have a better market, a better economy like the United States does. So both Reagan and Bush oversaw this process that eventually ended the Cold War. One of the big hallmark events of the end of the Cold War was when the Berlin Wall was torn down. Remember, the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, and immediately we wanted to get it torn down. The West and the East finally in 1989, when the wall came down, they were reunited as a democratic nation, so no more communist East Germany. And this led to eventually the the Soviet Union itself collapsing just 2 years later. One thing that George Bush had to face during his time in presidency was a riot in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. You have a place called University College, and you had a bunch of students, a lot of protesters from that university who wanted to overthrow the Chinese government in 1989. They said, okay, Mao has been dead for 13 years now. We need to move past his communist policies and become a free nation like the West is. And the protest was not successful at all. China remains a communist nation to this day, but a lot of people died in what was called the Tiananmen Square riots. Something we already talked about a little bit, but just a quick review here. When the U.S. sold weapons to Iran and then used the profits and gave them to the Contras, who were fighting the Sandinista in Nicaragua, this was called the Iran-Contra scandal. The White House advisors who were accused and later convicted of these illegal activities included people like Oliver North, who we talked about last time, and this all happened in 1987. So this was a big scandal for President Reagan. This is something that could have taken down his presidency, but because of the way he handled it so honestly and kind of open to the American public about what he knew, what he didn't know, and trying to fix it right away, unlike how Nixon did with Watergate, proved to be a much more successful maneuvering during a time of scandal. Definitely something to learn from there for future politicians. So the U.S. invaded two nations during the 1980s. They weren't big wars, you wouldn't say, but both of these invasions were to kind of show the world the power of the U.S. military and also show how the U.S. would protect its interests anywhere in the world and prevent other areas of the world from falling to communism. We're still operating under that Cold War mindset. So we specifically invaded two areas, Grenada and Panama, in order to prevent their governments from falling to communism, and both were successful. During George Bush's presidency, you have Operation Desert Storm, also known as the Gulf War. And this took place because Kuwait, which is a small country in the Middle East, it was invaded by Iraq in 1990. And the U.S. sent in over 500,000 troops. And in January of 1991, that is when this took place. Okay, just to go back a little bit here, when we invaded Grenada and Panama, as you see there, something to write in the margin, Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, this goes back to that as well. Both Panama and Grenada are in the Western Hemisphere. We are still operating under the idea that that area is ours to maintain and protect. All right, so that's why Reagan invaded Grenada and Panama. And at the same time, or just a year before, Margaret Thatcher of the UK invaded the Falklands, which is off the coast of Argentina in South America. All right, but back to George Bush's war here. The U.S. began Operation Desert Storm, and this was just a couple of months long. And within just a couple of months, the U.S. was able to take back Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq at this time, who had invaded Kuwait in order to get all of their oil. We did not want him to do that. We did not want to appease him like we had previously with Hitler, so we sent in troops and got him out of Kuwait very quickly. And with this, the U.S. liberated Kuwait from Iraqi control and said that this kind of tyranny and territorial expansion in the region will not be tolerated. All right, just a couple more things from this time period. A book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was written in 1962 about the environment and how it was an important issue. This came into play in the 1980s because nuclear power was expanding. Some people thought it was not good for the environment because how you might have an accident like 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, but people like Reagan and Bush, and I would probably agree with them, said no, it's a very safe form of energy as long as you have regulations of it to make sure that it's safe, and it's a very clean form of energy, which it certainly is. But the book Silent Spring came back into use at this time. Another book called Unsafe at Any Speed by a guy named Ralph Nader was about car safety, about how many car wrecks, how many collisions happen in America, which is certainly a big problem. And he became famous when he ran for president himself as an independent several different times. Okay, and finally here, there were several reasons why people were moving from the Midwest to the South, and why they have been ever since for the past 30 years or so. A big reason is because of jobs. You had a lot of factories in the Midwest that were shutting down, and the cost of living is much lower here in the South. Mississippi has the lowest cost of living, which means gas prices are lowest here. Prices for pretty much everything are lower here than anywhere else in the country. So you have a lot of people moving here, also with things like air conditioning, making it much more attractive to live in the South than it used to be 50 years before this time. All right, now flip the page, and the last thing we're going to talk about is the end of the Cold War. We've been talking about the Cold War ever since we finished up World War II, and now we are finally going to bring it to a close. Okay? At this point, when Reagan became president in 1981, the Cold War had been going on for 35 years. For 35 years, we had been staunch enemies of the Soviet Union, kind of on the brink of nuclear war, not really sure what was going to happen. We fought proxy wars in Korea and Cuba and Vietnam, but thankfully had never gone to full-out nuclear war with the Russians. Now, some presidents like Eisenhower, like Kennedy, like Nixon, had really improved relations with the Soviet Union during their time of leadership. And others, like Lyndon Johnson with Vietnam, like Carter with his foreign policy blunders, did not improve our relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, right? And then Reagan became president, and during his presidency, U.S. relations with the Soviet Union greatly improved. Now, this is something that a lot of people did not think would happen, since Reagan was such an aggressive person. Militarily, they thought that he would come across as an intimidator instead of someone who appears like an equal, kind of like Nixon did. But over the course of his time in office, he took a lot of great strides, made a lot of accomplishments we're about to talk about, that brought about the end of the Cold War shortly after he left office. So first off, starting where we last left off with the Cold War, the policy of détente. Remember, that's something that Nixon pursued, that Ford pursued, that Jimmy Carter tried to continue to pursue. But the reason why détente with the Soviet Union had really crumbled by the 1980s, a big reason was because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. It really showed the U.S. that we would no longer be able to abide by the rules of détente. We can't just keep reducing our number of nuclear weapons and trust the Russians to do the same, because they're probably not doing so. And with them being aggressors and invading Afghanistan, we said, okay, we need to go about a different strategy because détente is not working. Remember, President Carter responded to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan by boycotting the Summer Olympics in Moscow. Several other countries did that as well. And Carter attempted to sign a second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT II, he called it, but this failed, and the newly elected President Reagan was against détente. He said the time for détente is over, and we need a much more aggressive strategy if we want to not just end the Cold War, but win the Cold War. So in 1983, President Reagan made a speech in which he said something very shocking about the Soviet Union. He called the USSR an evil empire. Now, this was seen as very demeaning to the USSR, and it angered a lot of Soviet leaders. Here you have a U.S. president basically coming out and saying, you guys are the bad guys, all right? You are an evil empire, and we are the good guys. And Reagan said it was very important to say things like this because it reflected reality. He said we cannot continue to pretend like we are both equal sides in this war and that neither side is completely right or wrong. He said we need to show that we do have the moral high ground. We give people freedom, they take it away. We take care of our citizens, they do not. And the fact that he called the Soviet Union, with all of its abuses and all of its violence, called it an evil empire, this angered a lot of Soviet leaders. But Reagan was seeming to depict nuclear warfare here as simply an extension of the age-old struggle of good and evil. He said, times have not changed as much as you guys would like to think it is. They're still right, they're still wrong, and the U.S. is on the side of good, and the USSR is on the side of evil. He said, having nuclear weapons doesn't change morality. So this hardline stance against the USSR caused kind of a second arms race to develop, and it began to look like the Cold War would start to heat up again after it had been cooling off several years before with Nixon. All right, so we started to increase government spending on military again, and so did the Soviet Union. One thing that Reagan developed that he poured billions and billions of dollars into was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, something we talked about on the last page. SDI, which was nicknamed Star Wars by the media because Star Wars was a popular movie at the time, this intended to use lasers, missiles, and satellites to counter a potential Soviet nuclear attack against the US, basically saying, hey, instead of just trying to get the most nukes, let's try to develop a system that will make their nukes irrelevant, because if they launch them, we could just shoot them down before they can harm any Americans. Now, this device would have done this was never created just because of the sheer cost and technological limitations of it, but it did serve to scare the USSR, because if we have a device that can shoot down all of their nuclear missiles, it would be like they don't have any nuclear missiles, because none of them would be able to reach us. That would put them in a very dangerous position, because potentially we could nuke them with no consequences. So it scared them to death, and they tried to get Reagan to agree to dismantle SDI. He refused, so they poured money into a system that eventually made them go bankrupt, which led to the end and the fall of the Soviet Union. So SDI really was a brilliant strategy that was employed by Reagan. But like a lot of things that do good, it also cost a bunch of money. You know, how like the Great Society did good for some people, but it cost a lot of money. Same thing with the Strategic Defense Initiative. It did a lot of good, and it helped to end the Cold War eventually, but it also cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So the next person we're going to talk about is a very important person into understanding the 1980s and the end of the Cold War. And his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. He's actually still alive today. And he came to power in 1985 in the Soviet Union. When Reagan became president in 1981, Leonid Brezhnev, from back in the Nixon days, was still the leader of the USSR. Shortly after Reagan took office, he died. Then a guy named Yuri Andropov became the leader, and then he died within a year. And then Konstantin Chernenko came to power, and then he died again. And Reagan basically said, hey, I'm trying to have some foreign policy with the Soviet leaders, but they keep dying on me. And every time they had a funeral, George Bush was sent to the funeral for the Americans. But eventually, Mikhail Gorbachev he ascended to the leadership in the Soviet Union, and he had the intention of easing tensions with the U.S. caused by the Cold War. He believed that it was a good thing. It would be a good thing for the Cold War to come to an end. So he wanted to moderate the USSR and kind of ease some of the communist sanctions that they had. So in the 80s, Gorbachev introduced two new ideas. They were called perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika and glasnost. Be sure to know the difference between these two. Perestroika was his idea to reform and improve the Soviet economy to be able to compete in a free market global economy. Okay, so under a communist system, you have something called a command economy, where the government has complete control over it, and that kind of economy usually doesn't go anywhere. So he said we need to reform it, like China has been reforming theirs ever since Nixon opened up China, and we need to be able to compete with global free market capitalism. And then glasnost was his plan to bring an openness to Soviet society and to bring more freedom to Soviet citizens. So both of these things together, perestroika and glasnost, both helped to eventually bring an end to the Cold War. So Reagan and Gorbachev began to communicate. And through their discussions, they were able to reach some agreements and make a lot of progress on improving relations between the Soviets and the Americans. And after so many years of meeting and negotiating with each other, finally in 1988, Reagan's last year in office, Reagan visited Gorbachev in the USSR and took a tour of Moscow, and he saw that it was really a different place than it had been 5 years earlier. So a reporter asked President Reagan if he still considered the USSR to be an evil empire, and everyone was looking at him, and Reagan said, no, that was said during another time, another era. All right, basically saying this isn't the same country anymore. This country has improved. It is no longer the evil empire that it was. Notice, Reagan didn't say, I'm sorry for saying that it was an evil empire. He's saying, no, it was. Okay, he didn't back down from that. But he said it is no longer an evil empire because of the progress that it had made towards opening itself up to its citizens, reforming its economy, and giving its people more freedom. So Gorbachev and Reagan had developed a very good relationship, and they were able to make some very good and necessary negotiations together that brought about the end of the war. So remember, ever since 1961, the Berlin Wall had just been a stain on Europe. It had been a symbol of Soviet strength that had really kept people in East Berlin trapped in a communist society. And ever since Kennedy had said that famous phrase in that speech he made, Ich bin ein Berliner, the U.S. had wanted the wall to come down. Okay? And we've been trying to get the wall torn down. We had been trying to get the wall torn down ever since 1961. So Reagan, at a speech that he made in 1987 at the Brandenburg Gate of the Berlin Wall in West Germany, he famously said, "Mr. Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you really want this Cold War to end, if you really want society to be more free and for there to be less bloodshed and for life to be better in Europe and in the world," he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, come to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And that became a very famous line that he said, probably the most famous 4 words of his presidency. He said, "Tear down this wall." And 2 years later, sure enough, the wall came down. The residents of Berlin marched to the Berlin Wall, and not stopped by the Soviet soldiers, they tore the Berlin Wall down piece by piece with axes and sledgehammers. Now, what was really important here is that Gorbachev could have ordered the Soviet troops at the gate and at the wall to shoot the crowd of people, just to open fire. And the Soviets had done much worse before. But he didn't. He said, you know what, if they want it torn down so bad, maybe we should let them do it. And that very wise and charitable and benevolent decision that Gorbachev made marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. So this destruction of the Berlin Wall and later the reunification of Germany that happened not long after this really symbolized that the end of the Cold War was very near. So throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the U.S. helped cause the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, really over the course of 2 years, of 1990 and 1991, just one by one. You have all these Eastern European countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, all these different places, you have the communist regimes falling in those countries. And then finally, in 1991, after it had become clear that the Soviet Union had become bankrupt through both the space race and their strategic defense initiative pouring into their military to try to compete with us, and also just the economy that was so bad for so long under communism, eventually they'd become bankrupt and they were quickly losing their influence in the world. And so Gorbachev then decided to resign as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, and he declared that there would not be another one. So the policies of perestroika and glasnost had worked to bring an end to the Cold War by helping cause the fall of the communist regime in the USSR in 1991. All right, so this was December 26, 1991. By this time, Reagan had left office, and his former vice president, George Bush, was in office. And Mikhail Gorbachev, he signed the last paper dissolving the Soviet Union, and then he called President Bush and wished him a Merry Christmas. All right, so the Soviet Union was broken up on this day into 15 independent countries. That is why the Soviet Union no longer exists today. Now it is Russia and about 15 other countries, countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, right? So all these stands that you probably heard of maybe, but don't know exactly where they are. If you look at that map, all those areas outside of Russia that are still in the red, those used to be a part of the Soviet Union. Okay? It was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Those were some of the republics. Now they are all independent countries, and different forms of government took place. Okay? It took root in these former Soviet states, right? So all that area in the red, communism had left that area. This happened much faster than anyone thought that it would. It was almost miraculous how quickly the war ended once the Berlin Wall fell down. So this officially ended the Cold War after 45 long years.